On the line with us is Dr. Stephanie Kelton. Stephanie Kelton is one of the leaders of the modern monetary theory movement, as it were. She's a professor of public policy and economics at Stony Brook University, former chief economist to the U.S. Senate Budget Committee, and an advisor to the Bernie Sanders 2016 campaign. One of the founding fellows of the Sanders Institute. Her website, Stephanie, i.e. Kelton, Kelton.com. And her Twitter handle is also Stephanie Kelton. Stephanie Kelton, Professor Kelton, welcome back.
Thanks, Tom. Good to be with you.
It is great having you with us on the program. You wrote this brilliant piece called "We Can Pay for a Green New Deal." I found it over at Common Dreams. I'm guessing it probably popped up in other places as well. And just to start at the beginning, well, I guess there's two beginnings. One is the disaster, the economic disaster, in addition to all the other levels of disaster of climate change, which is actually not something off in the distant future, is literally happening right now in front of us, on the one hand. And on the other hand, how Franklin Roosevelt paid for the New Deal. Can I toss those to you as a starting point for a riff on this?
Yeah, sure. I think that increasingly we're getting to the point where the public is recognizing that this is not a problem that's off in the distance. It's not something that we can escape. There's virtually no part of the country that's immune from the threat of climate change. And I think recent reports from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the recently released report out of this administration, no less, federal scientists in a 1,600-page report telling us that this is a clear and present danger. So I think increasingly the good news is that we're aware, and we're aware that this thing is barreling down on us at a rate that requires immediate action. This is not something we can wait to address somewhere down the road in the distant future. So with that as the backdrop, the question then inevitably becomes, as people say, well, we got to do something, right? And you've got people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the Sunrise Movement. They're occupying Leader Pelosi or presumptive Leader Pelosi's office and saying, we want action. We want a Green New Deal. And, of course, the first question is, well, how are you going to pay for it? And then we get all bogged down in these questions about, affordability. Nancy Pelosi's talking about, bringing back PAYGO, which is like a disaster, right, if when the Democrats take back the House and if she becomes leader. And so you got all this stuff going on. And so what we wanted to do in this piece, I along with my co-authors, and we wrote the piece for the Huffington Post, was to say, listen, if we're going to do what must be done, if we're going to take bold action on the order, if you're calling it the New Deal, then we've got to do something like what Roosevelt did in the New Deal, a massive transformation of the economy, huge mobilization of resources, and that is going to require a commitment on the part of the federal government to fund that transition. And so we have got to get over this belief we have that we're still trapped on a gold standard. This is not the way Roosevelt proceeded. If you remember, and I know you do because I've read your books and you get the history, you know that Roosevelt abandoned the gold standard in order to pursue the big, ambitious programs, first the New Deal and then World War II fighting, that we went off the gold standard. We transformed our monetary system so that we could free ourselves up to do these big, ambitious spending programs. And now, here we are with a monetary system that gives us all the flexibility we need to fund a Green New Deal. And we've got a speaker, presumably, coming in and talking about, tying us back to the cross of gold. So that's what we wanted to do in this piece. Yeah,
and the cross of gold being actually, she's not talking about going back to the gold standard, but the PAYGO thing is this neoliberal / Republican idea that if Trump cuts taxes by $5 trillion, $1.5 trillion in the first year, you don't need to offset that somehow. But if Democrats want to, do a Green New Deal and literally save the human race from extinction, and say, or over the short term, save modern civilization, which is actually fraying in the places where climate change is really hitting hard, like in the Fertile Crescent, the Mideast, causing the Syrian conflict and other things. We can't afford that. We have to pay for that. Well, without putting it in the frame of the gold standard, the idea that the government should be run like a business or a family is basically orthodoxy on the Republican side, although they don't live this way, obviously, but this is what they say, and it has been embraced by the new Dems, basically the neoliberals, the DLC Dems in the Democratic Party. How do you respond to that?
Well, not well.
Why does it not matter, I guess, is the question.
No, I mean, look, this is pretty much why I get out of bed every single day, is to help push the Overton window so that we get better policy. And you're exactly right. The new Dems are definitely not helping. In fact, they are part of the opposition. If we're going to get something like a Green New Deal, it's going to require people to drop this framing that you referenced, that the federal government is basically just like a household, that it has to play by the same set of rules, faces the same sorts of constraints, has to, quote, live within its means. It's, fiscally irresponsible to spend more than it takes in. It should be paying down debt and worrying about the budget deficit and all this kind of stuff. And this is going to absolutely 100% stand in the way of any progressive agenda, not just the Green New Deal, but Medicare for all, making public colleges and universities tuition free, even something as basic as doing some, run-of-the-mill infrastructure investment. I mean, it's going to thwart the entire progressive agenda. So I worked very hard to help, pull back the curtain on how the modern monetary system actually works and how government finance actually works in the modern era.
So let's just lay that out explicitly. One of the DLC Dems or a Republican would come along and say, well, Dr. Kelton, that sounds very good, but right now we've got a $20+ trillion deficit, and at 3% interest rate, we're spending $600 billion a year in interest on the debt. Correct my math if it's wrong. And if interest rates go up, that could be even more than the Pentagon budget. Where's that money going to come from, and how and don't you reach a crisis point where you just literally can't afford the interest on the national debt?
So you just gave me a ton of stuff to unpack, and I don't know whether you plan to be with me for the next 3 hours, but I could take that long.
We've got about 5 minutes, 4 minutes.
It's like 6 chapters of the book I'm working on that you just packed into that one question. But look, let me do it as quickly.
But if we don't have a quick answer to that question, we're screwed.
Yeah, so the answer to the question is there is no debt crisis. There is no long-term debt crisis. There is no short-term debt crisis. There will never come a time when the federal government of the United States of America has obligations, bills coming due in U.S. dollars, that it is unable to pay. The reason is simple, and the reason is because the United States government literally holds the patent on the creation of the U.S. dollar. It can't legally come from anywhere else. You and I can't create the dollar. That's what makes us different from the federal government. That's why households aren't like the federal government. We're users of the currency. We use the U.S. dollar. The federal government is the issuer of the dollar. And as such, it can never run out of money. It can never have things that it wants to buy that it can't afford to purchase. If there are things for sale in dollars, if there are people who are willing to work in exchange for the dollar, the government can hire anybody it wants to employ, put them to work on new Green Deal jobs and other sorts of things, and it's never going to face a solvency crisis. It can't turn into Greece. We don't depend on China. I mean, all of these sorts of things that you hear politicians like Paul Ryan and New Dems and others saying are just missing a basic fundamental point, which is that the U.S. dollar comes from the U.S. government and it can't come from anywhere else.
But then they come back and they say, oh my God, you're talking about printing more money? You're going to debase the currency. We're going to have 30% inflation.
Okay, so then we have to take that one. So what I'll often say is once you get your opponent arguing on inflation, you've already won the argument, because at least then you're talking about the right constraints. Mm-hmm. And inflation is a legitimate constraint. So then you have to say, okay, how would we go about planning for a transition from an economy that is based and built around fossil fuels to one that is built around clean energy, around a green economy. And this is exactly the kind of problem that Keynes tackled. John Maynard Keynes, probably the most important economist of the last century. This is the same problem Keynes tackled when Britain and the U.S. were entering World War II. And he wrote a very famous piece, and it was called How to Pay for the War. And that piece was all about how to carefully plan the use of the resources, the manpower, the machines, the factories. How do you redirect the manufacturing and production and employment in an economy away from consumption-based consumer economy toward a war economy, and to do it in a way that doesn't risk accelerating inflation? That's exactly what Keynes laid out and other economists in the 1940s, and that's exactly the kind of thing we should be working on today. We have the power of the purse. The question is, how do we deploy the power of the purse in a way that's responsible so we have a just transition away from fossil fuels to a green economy where we don't leave people behind who lose jobs in coal and fracking and offshore drilling in other places. We bring all those people along, put them to work in good-paying jobs oriented around, the goal of getting to 100% renewable energy.
You are absolutely one of the most brilliant people I know. Dr. Stephanie Kelton, professor of public policy and economics at Stony Brook University, former chief economist for the U.S. Senate Budget Committee, advisor to Bernie Sanders in 2016, and a founding fellow of the Sanders Institute. StephanieKelton.com is the website, and you can tweet her at Stephanie Kelton. Dr. Kelton, thank you so much for being with us.
Always my pleasure, Tom. Thank you.
And mine too. Thank you so much.